So, have you ever just looked up at the night sky and tried to truly wrap your head around our scale? The source material we're looking at today makes a profoundly humbling point right out of the gate. Earth is just a speck in the universe. Our existence is nil. I mean, when you really look at the sheer unimaginable vastness of space, our planet, it's nothing more than a microscopic dot. But here's the crazy part. On this tiny dot, something extraordinary happened. Life didn't just emerge, it exploded into millions of complex, incredibly adapted forms. So how exactly did that happen? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack the absolute most fundamental biological framework that explains our very existence. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're mapping out the vast, honestly fascinating biological framework of evolution. We're using this explainer to take a massive, sometimes overwhelming subject and break it down into a really clear, simple conceptual framework. We'll trace the whole journey from the literal spark of life to the complex natural mechanisms that shape every single living thing around us today. Just to keep us on track, here's a quick roadmap for what we're going to cover. We'll start with Earth's first sparks, then move on to theories of change. From there, we'll break down natural selection explained, check out evolution in action, and finally, we'll wrap up with the anatomical evidence. All right, Section 1, Earth's first sparks, from the Big Bang to the first cells. When we look at the origins of life, the sheer staggering scale of time it's hard to fathom. According to our sources, the universe burst into existence around 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang, which was initially just this massive expansion of hydrogen and helium. Fast forward to 4.5 billion years ago, and our Earth finally forms. But it wasn't an instant recipe for life, not at all. It took another 1.5 billion years, around 3.0 billion years ago, for the very first non-cellular life to appear. And it wasn't until 2.0 billion years ago that the first actual cellular life showed up on the scene. So what did that early 4.5 billion-year-old Earth actually look like? Well, honestly, it was practically a fiery hellscape. Prebiotic Earth had absolutely zero free oxygen. It had what's called a reducing atmosphere, which was basically just choked with carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water vapor violently erupting from endless volcanoes. And because there was no ozone layer to protect anything, harsh UV rays continuously split that water vapor into hydrogen and oxygen. Then, after millions of years of the Earth finally cooling down, torrential, endless rains poured down. They filled immense craters and mixed with all those atmospheric chemicals to create what the scientist J.B.S. Haldane famously called a hot, dilute soup in the oceans. Which brings us to one of the most famous scientific demonstrations in history, the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment. These guys literally recreated this ancient volatile environment right in a lab. They took boiling water to create vapor, mixed it with methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and then this is the wild part, exposed it to 800 degrees Celsius and a massive 75,000-volt spark to simulate primeval lightning. And the result? After just 18 days, the condensed liquid trapped at the bottom of their apparatus contained simple amino acids, the exact building blocks of proteins. This proved that the chemical evolution of life wasn't just some wild theory. It was entirely possible in Earth's early oceans. Of course, before we had this incredible chemical understanding, early theories were, well, let's just say a little less scientific. There was a theory of special creation, claiming life was made as is and the Earth was only 4,000 years old. Then panspermia suggested life arrived on meteors as tiny spores. And my personal favorite, abiogenesis, or spontaneous generation, where people genuinely believed things like mice just magically spawned from muddy, sweaty shirts left in a barn. Luckily, Louis Pasteur's famous swan neck flask experiment finally proved biogenesis, the undeniable fact that life can only come from pre-existing life. Moving right along, Section 2, Theories of Change. How do species evolve? Let's contrast two major historical thinkers here. First up, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He proposed the inheritance of acquired characters. He basically argued that if a giraffe stretched its neck really hard to reach high leaves over its lifetime, its babies would just be born with longer necks. This theory of an internal force was famously disproved by a guy named August Weismann, who spent 22 generations cutting off the tails of mice, only to find the babies kept being born with tails. So yeah, changes to our body during our life do not alter our genetics. Then came Charles Darwin. Darwin argued for natural selection. He noted that variations already exist within a population before the environment even changes. The environment doesn't cause the change, it just selects the individuals who already happen to have the most helpful pre-existing traits. Now, Darwin's absolute light bulb moment came from reading an economist named Thomas Malthus.
Malthus noted that populations have the potential to grow exponentially, but they don't. Why? Because resources are limited, and limited resources mean intense competition. This brilliantly illustrates why life is a constant struggle for existence. Because not everyone can survive, only the fittest, meaning those with the best variations for their specific environment, will actually live long enough to reproduce. Section 3. Natural Selection Explained. Adapting to Survive.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding what an adaptation actually is. Adaptations are simply useful variations that help an organism survive and reproduce in its specific, current environment. Darwin really emphasized that these variations are small, they're heritable, and they're directional, meaning they push the population toward a very specific survival advantage. This is in sharp contrast to the scientist Hugo de Vries, who argued that evolution happened through saltation, basically large, random, directionless, single-step mutations. Darwin's model is much more gradual and totally focused on environmental fit. And this perfectly illustrates how nature actually pushes populations, falling into 3 distinct categories. First, stabilizing selection. This forms a central peak, favoring the average trait. A classic example, human baby weights. Babies that are too small or too large have lower survival rates, so the average 3 to 3.5 kilogram weight is naturally selected. Second, directional selection. This shifts to one side, favoring one extreme, like mobs adapting to pollution. And third, disruptive selection. This splits into 2 extreme peaks, entirely eliminating the middle. Think of snails on rocks and sand. Black shells hide well on rocks, white shells hide on sand, but gray shells, they stand out everywhere and just get eaten.
All right, Section 4. Evolution in Action. Witnessing Change.
Let's look a bit closer at that moth example, also known as industrial melanism in England. In the 1850s, before widespread factories, tree barks were covered in light-colored lichen. Light moths easily hid from birds, while the rare dark moths were spotted and eaten. But by the 1920s, factory soot had killed the lichen and blackened the tree bark. Suddenly, the light moths were the ones standing out, and the dark moths were perfectly camouflaged. The population shifted dramatically. Notice, neither moth was ever completely wiped out. The pre-existing variation was simply naturally selected based on the totally new environment. And we are forcing this to happen even faster today through anthropogenic, or human-driven, selection. Because of our massive overuse of antibiotics, we have accidentally selected for highly resistant strains of bacteria. We spray fields with DDT, killing 99% of mosquitoes, only to leave behind the 1% that are naturally resistant, who then breed an unstoppable superswarm. Because bacteria and insects have incredibly fast life cycles, we can literally watch them evolve within a single human lifespan. Think about that. If our actions can drive evolution this rapidly, just imagine what nature can do over millions of years. A really beautiful, natural example of this is Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. A single ancestral seed-eating bird flew over from mainland South America, but the islands offered completely different foods. On an island with tough seeds, birds with pre-existing thicker, broader beaks survived better. On an island with insects, birds with longer, pointed beaks thrived. Over generations, these beneficial variations compounded until they became entirely different species, perfectly adapted to their specific niche. And our final section, Section 5, the anatomical evidence, clues in our biology. The source material highlights 2 very important, often confused anatomical concepts. First, homologous organs. These have the exact same biological origin, but have adapted to perform completely different functions. This represents divergent evolution, starting together and branching apart. Second, analogous organs. These have completely different origins, but have adapted to perform the exact same function. This represents convergent evolution, starting apart, but coming together to solve the very same environmental problem. To make this crystal clear, homologous organs mean we share the exact same bone structure with a cheetah, a bat, and a whale. We're talking the humerus, radius, ulna, and carpals. But a cheetah runs, a bat flies, a whale swims, and we grasp objects. We share a common mammalian ancestor, but our environments caused our limbs to diverge in function. On the flip side, analogous organs. Look at the wings of a bird and an insect. An insect is an invertebrate, a bird is a vertebrate. Completely different anatomical origins, but they both independently evolved wings simply because they both needed to fly. All of this incredible complexity brings us to one of the most humbling takeaways from our sources. Evolution is a stochastic process. That means it is entirely random, unpredictable, and absolutely unguided by past events. There's no grand script, no predetermined end goal. Nature simply reacts to the immediate environment. Whatever variation works today is exactly what gets passed on to tomorrow.
And that leaves us with a truly fascinating question. If evolution is this unguided, unscripted process, constantly reacting to the immediate environment, then look around at the world we're building right now. With our changing climate, our technology, our modern diets, what traits do you think nature will select next for human survival? Thank you so much for exploring this framework with me today. Stay curious, keep observing, and I'll see you in the next explainer.